Rewritten! Nephrite remembered what it was like to be corrupted. Nothing had made sense. She could hardly see or hear. Every movement felt like the stab of a dagger. She didn't know what was going on, every thought unable to connect to the next. She had been so afraid that she'd been reduced to her most animalistic instincts, only able to lash out aimlessly, her body mutated and monstrous, the song of the diamonds echoing through her ears to drive her further down into the abyssal pit of madness. She had suffered like that for decades. Until Stephen. The one time Nephrite had surfaced was whenever he tried to heal her. She could still hear the diamond song. She was still disoriented and lost, but she had gotten the dose of clarity that she needed, for just long enough to give him hope to keep trying. And now, after all that time, Nephrite had her life back. Stephen had been the one to save them all. Every single corrupted gem on this Earth's crust had been saved from their own minds, allowed to live out the lives that they never could have imagined living. But now, Stephen had been corrupted. It was a sick irony that he had fallen into it, right after pushing everyone else out. Nephrite was good friends with the hybrid boy, but she didn't live with him like his family. They talked every once in a while, but they'd mostly gone their separate ways off to live their own lives after she was better again. She hadn't heard anything about Stephen, other than rumors of strange behavior that passed through the uncorrupted students of Little Home School. When the monster erupted from seemingly nowhere, Nephrite had been scared like everyone else. But now that she had learned that it had been Stephen, the empathy was painful. Every other uncorrupted gem felt it too. All of them, at some point, had been healed and introduced to their new lives by him. To learn that the gentle, loving, patient hero they'd all known was now experiencing something they'd never wish on their worst enemy, it was almost impossible to stand. Nephrite had to do something. All of them did. That was why they'd come up with a plan by morning. Stephen's closer family had gathered together with the gems who weren't occupied with trying to find rations for the humans, formulating a plan all night long on what they could do to stop him without hurting him. The biggest problem was Stephen's lack of poofing. They couldn't just attack him and bubble his gemstone away. They had to be careful, but not too careful where they end up shattering anyway. So instead of being able to put his poofed gemstone in the diamond's essence and letting him reform, they had to somehow submerge his gem in the healing fluids while he was still in his monstrous form. And after hours and hours of grueling brainstorming, they managed to mix their resources to figure out the best way to go about this. They rehearsed, they memorized, they prepared themselves, and now they were ready. But not everyone could go. Some gems were still poofed. Lars's crew, as well as the handful of other gems, would stay behind to guard. With the Sun Incinerator, they might be able to hold their ground against Bluebird's rebellion. They still didn't know where they had retreated to, but if they showed their faces again, they needed to keep them from ruining the plan. All of the humans, whether they were injured or not, were left behind. All except for Stephen's human father. Though he'd be monitored carefully by the other gems, he was allowed to come simply because of his connection to his son. Out of anybody in all of Beach City, he would have the best chance of reaching him after the corruption to calm him down. They didn't know what he'd be like after, if this plan even worked. He'd been pretty bad before, and he was still halfway fused of a dead human. Nephrite had led gems into battle during the war, and their march back to the ruins of Beach City felt so similar that she was almost breathless with dread. But she couldn't falter because of bad memories. She had to be there for Stephen, just like everyone else who was marching alongside her. The 3 towering diamonds were around the group as they made their way through the thickly wooded forest. White Diamond was at the front, with Blue Diamond on the right and Yellow Diamond on the left, forming a triangle-like form to protect the smaller gems in between them. It was difficult to move through the earth trees, but the ones at the front made the way for the ones at the back, following in the ground-shaking footsteps of their monarchs. Nephrite found herself near the head, where Stephen's family was. Despite how the crystal gems were at the front, they actually weren't the most vital part of this plan. They were just going to be there for him after he's uncorrupted, like Greg. The whole reason that Nephrite was here with them was because she was going to have to do it. Stephen didn't need to be told to calm down or that he was loved. He needed to remember who he was. He needed someone who knew what corruption was like to help him stop fighting for long enough for the plan to work. Nephrite looked to the left, where Garnet, who had managed to pull herself together again, Amethyst, Pearl, and Greg were walking. They had their sights set on the scarlet-streaked horizon, determination flaring as hot as the rising sun in their eyes. She looked to the right, where Spinel and Pink Pearl walked, the two having courage masking their doubts, knowing that they had to be there for their brother. She looked up at the diamonds, where Lapis, Bismuth, and Peridot were flying, the trio soaring back and forth to keep in pace with the group, all of them ready. She looked behind her, where the uncorrupted homeschool students plowed through the forest together, helping each other, repeating the plan to the more forgetful or nervous ones, reassuring each other that they could do this for him. Then she looked forward again, a sense of drive and purpose to her step as she moved over fallen trees and around tangling thorn bushes, marching ever closer to the smoking wreck that had become the middle of the town. They had to do this. No, they would do this. For Stephen. Just as he had done for them. As the roaring sounds of Stephen's monster grew louder, the tension grew, even the smallest whispers of conversations drifting away into nothing. The familiar fear set in around her face, though the cold didn't reach her chest. She was ready. The trees peeled away into countryside, which soon became overturned dirt speckled with bits of thrown rubble. Eventually, the rubble became more and more consistent until they were standing on pavements between abandoned buildings. Most telephone poles had fallen from the shaking of the earth, most windows shattered into pieces. But most of the outer city was intact. But that didn't hide the beast only a few blocks away. Above them, casting a wide and dark shadow over them, was Stephen. He was just as intimidating as before, if not more, in the reddening light of dawn. He was like an absolutely massive lizard, layers of pink scales overlapping like armor to form a thick hide over heaping masses of muscle tied strongly together. His back was filled with clustering quills, prickling up and bristling like an angry cat's arching back, hooked horns curling over his head and around his fang-lined jaws like a trident. His 4 melting eyes rolled wildly in his head, his 6 crushing limbs stomping down into the earth, his swinging tail tipped in a star-like mace of spikes that clobbered into anything that stood in its path. Nephrite could just barely spot it, but she caught sight of the flapping piece of fabric on the tips of one of his horns. Stephen's jacket was stuck there, speared like the head of an overthrown king. His sheer power was enough to almost freeze them in their tracks, a sudden urge of instinctual fear making them want to run away as far as they could get from the gigantic, destructive beast. He hadn't seen them yet, even though they were only a few miles away. His dulled senses made sure of that. He was going in circles near the middle of the town, trampling the same 10 buildings over and over again, his head panting and whimpering, stumbling haphazardly left and right with his gnashing maw groaning in dizziness and confusion. His pained noises, his aimless, unstable body language, all of it felt like a twisting wrench to her gem. Nephrite knew the pain that he was lost in. She recognized it all too well. Her drive to help him swelled past any fear that she felt before. She never wanted anybody to feel that way ever again. Fueled by that, Nephrite continued forward, everybody around her seeming to come to the same mindset. At the Knot of the Diamonds and the Crystal Gems, the group of homeschool students split into 2, going separate ways in a wide arc around him, near the borders of the city. They needed to surround him, but since he wasn't staying still, they'd have to make their pathway wider than anticipated. Nephrite watched as they lined up as many as they could at once, so far away that the 2 sides signaled each other that they were ready with quick flashes of their gems. Now there were 2 lines of gems on either side of Beach City, creating almost a funnel-like formation that led towards the dark, foaming waves of the ocean. The crystal gems and the diamonds had stayed where they are, like a lid of a box, facing Stephen where he paced back and forth, unaware of the ambush. The signal to begin came to them in a burst of light from the fusing diamonds. Their forms slithered together like mixing water, growing to a size that challenged Stephen's. Mint Diamond appeared, her gleaming armored robes fluttering out behind her, the long, glossy hair held down by the horned crown-like helmet. Her brilliance rivaled Stephen's strength, the pale green light catching his attention. The scaly pink monster's head swiveled in her direction, tripping slightly from surprise. His eyes were still in focus, not following Mint Diamond's movements, but he had picked up on the flash of light. He made a low, warning growl rumble through the ground, his spines raising in alarm with his 6 paws planted firmly, tail raised like a mace at the ready. Mint Diamond's lowest pair of hands reached down and let Garnet, Amethyst, Pearl, Volleyball, Spinel, Greg, and Nephrite climb up onto her palms, lifting them up onto each of her broad, bust-long shoulders. Nephrite and the others clung onto the strands of her white hair for support, giving her a thumbs up whenever they were all secure. At that, Mint Diamond began to approach Stephen, her 6 arms spread wide to herd him where she wanted him to go. The homeschool students watched with round eyes as the mountainous fusion shuffled back and forth with the shifts to its stance, like someone was closing in on a skittish animal, making sure that Stephen didn't try to sneak around them. When she was about 1 block away, Stephen spat an agitated hiss, raising his quill-forested back higher, eyes gleaming in defense. "Easy, easy," Mint Diamond warned, slowing down. "We don't want to hurt you." It was a precarious situation, every twitch of movement like a crackle of lightning, the tension squeezing her chest and pressuring every inch of her gem's surface until she wanted to bolt forwards and force him to submit. But they had to be careful, or else Stephen would very quickly switch to attack mode, risking the lives of everybody here, even Mint Diamond. A riled-up corrupted gem was a deadly corrupted gem. The glamorous fusion stepped one pace forward, then another, testing him. Stephen whimpered and began to scurry off to the right. At that move, however, he was stopped by the line of homeschool students, which began to holler and shoot off flashy shots of their weapons. None of them meant to hit him, only meant to be loud. He was spooked by the sudden noise, bellowing in affright as he turned to see Mint Diamond getting closer. He was where the boardwalk used to be, but not in the ocean, and he seemed to be getting close to his temper's limit. "Easy, Stephen, just a little farther," Mint Diamond tried cautiously, waving him in the direction of the water. But the reptilian beast roared in protest instead, the stress snapping like a splintering twig bent too far. Instead of continuing to back up, Stephen reared up on his back legs with a quaking scream of defiance, crashing down onto Mint Diamond with the weight of what seemed like the whole planet. Mint Diamond yelled, her sets of arms quickly bracing herself against him, her heels digging into the ruined pavement and grating backwards as she began to get pushed away from him, his wildly flashing claws and tail scoring light-spewing gashes over her front, scarily close to two of her gems. Mint Diamond jerked back, letting go quickly to hope to knock him off balance again, but Stephen managed to keep upright this time, his tail stretching to counter the surprise. He landed on his front feet again and swung his mace-ended tail around, whamming it into Mint Diamond's side. She was sent tumbling to the ground, caught off guard, Nephrite and the others barely managing to hang on as she rolled to a stop, hurrying to get up again. Stephen had retreated, baring his gnashing teeth and arching his back again, his quills rattling against each other in an almost rhythmic sound, like a cicada swarm. Mint Diamond gathered herself, holding her injured side while raising the other sets of arms again, saying, Calm down, Stephen. We aren't here to fight you." She approached him again, forcing him to back away step by step, the rattling of the spines increasing like quickening heartbeats, his back feet passing the gritty sand and touching the shore's first waves of water. He glanced back, recognition flashing through his gaze, refusing to step another step with a snap of his jaws. Nephrite had seen that Lapis had chained him down in the ocean before. He must have learned from his mistake. "You're gonna have to force him in. He won't go on his own," Nephrite called, clinging on to a strand of hair close to her ear. Mint Diamond steeled herself, preparing for the struggle, and began to reach out towards Stephen, way closer than he liked. The hissing rose to a yowl as fast as a dirt bike climbing a hill, shooting off at the top as her hands finally met his scales. He exploded in a shriek of flying claws and biting teeth as Mint Diamond began to run with him, pushing him over as she held onto him with her hands, receiving hit after hit as he tangled with her, falling over and over into the ocean. They sent geysers of salty spray up from the water, holding him as they grappled on the gravel-covered sea floor, coming to a crumbling stop with Mint Diamond on top and Stephen writhing below her. He was furious and panicked, roaring with the power to blast the water away from them in a circle, only to have it crash back in on them in a giant wave, only disorienting him further as Mint Diamond got a hold of his horns and his tail again, trying to keep their control over the situation. "Go! Hurry!" Mint Diamond ordered, Nephrite already jumping off. "He's not going to do this the easy way!" Nephrite rained out of the fusion's crystalline white hair, dropping like lice onto Stephen's scaly back, managing not to spear herself on his quills. She landed heavily, immediately gripping onto the nearest spike as he shifted and buckled beneath them. She had landed somewhere between his shoulder blades and was already climbing as fast as she could over the rippling, unstable footing, using the spines as support as she did. She was so small that she might as well be a beetle to him, but it didn't matter how small she was. She knew Stephen. They needed to calm him down. If Stephen could do it to Nephrite whenever she was centipedal, she could do it to Stephen while he was this thing. Flaming determination hardened in her as she clawed her way up Stephen's neck, slipping here and there, but always gaining more ground than she lost. She was on top of his forehead now, trying to ease her way onto his nose. With a sudden jolting roar, Stephen's head reared up, Mint Diamond's grip slipping. Nephrite was nearly thrown off, tumbling over and over in the air, catching onto the bottom line of his teeth just before she fell off into the splashing sea. She held onto his gums, her legs swinging below her, yanking her body back up with all the strength that she had. Avoiding his fangs, she heaved herself up over his cheek and onto the bridge of his nose, trying to scoot up closer to his eye. His face's scales were smoother than his back, lacking spines, making it twice as hard to get a grip. But she managed, just barely, to find a foothold right under his eye. He He was blinking fast, trying to dislodge the speck that was climbing all over his face, but his head stayed relatively still due to Mint Diamond's hold on his horns. She had to be quick. She had to let him know who he was. "Stephen!" she began, shouting as loud as her voice allowed. "It's Nephrite! Senti! Do you remember me?" His fused eyes rotated around, the diamond-shaped pupils focusing on her face. "I used to be just like you, remember?" she continued with a slight smile. "You tamed me with a bag of chips, and I saved you from the stalactite. You helped me get back to my crew, and you went to Homeworld to heal all of us." Stephen slowed in his struggle, the faraway look focusing just enough to give her hope. "You're not a monster! You're Stephen, remember?" Nephrite called. "You saved everyone! You're a hero! You can be a hero again! You just have to relax, okay?" He groaned something that might have been words, his confusion like a mirror to her. Centipedal hugged his face, saying, deep breaths. We're not going to hurt you, trust me. I'd never leave you to suffer like I did. You're going to be okay. Let the diamonds heal you." He looked so tired. He began to give in, shuddering with one last push of resistance against Mint Diamond, making a wave of ripples on the water around his legs. He whimpered pitifully, his eyes begging for her help, breathing so hard and fast that she thought that he'd hyperventilate. He felt trapped and scared, with nowhere to run. Weariness from hunger and exhaustion seemed to be weighing him down heavier than ever, with Nephrite's whispered comforts lulling him into submission. "You're all right, Stephen. It'll be over soon, trust me. You'll be all better in no time. I'll help you just like you helped me." Even as he kneeled down in the water, his belly and, in turn, his gem submerged, he looked as if he had lost. He bent his head down low with a crippled whine, resting his chin on the sandy floor of the shallow water, trembling like an abandoned dog from fear and pain. When he made no move to fight back again, Mint Diamond relaxed her hold, but only a little. Stephen only shook from his own emotions, the tension gripping every muscle and spine. His eyes drooped shut. He looked so hopeless and feeble that it was hard to imagine that he'd been rampaging only a few days ago. He looked like he'd given up, waiting for them to kill him, even though their intent was far from that. Mint Diamond touched one of her hands to the lower gem on her chest, Blue's. A dark azure glow pulsed out from her, bathing everyone in their chilling magic. Like she had pressed a button, her powers plugged a new emotion into every gem here. The heavy, painful, murky sadness. Tears came as easily as a servant obeying their master, yanked out of them whether they wanted them to or not. Not for everyone, though. Nephrite didn't cry. She had felt worse before. Both Lapis and Spinel had felt worse, too. No tears came from them. But their lack of tears wouldn't make this mission fail. Mint Diamond's own eyes began to squint and redden, allowing the yellow, blue, and white-tinted tears dripping into the ocean below and spreading out like spilled blood. That was what they needed. All four of the diamond's essence was the only known substance to cure corruption. Though further mental healing would be needed to ensure that they didn't revert in the future, they couldn't do that until they were physically capable of rational, sane thoughts. However, Nephrite realized something concerning just as she began to think that this would really turn out okay. Stephen wasn't crying. They needed all four of them for this to work. But he... "Oh, Stephen," Nephrite began pityingly. "You're not... Would it still work?" Yellow's tears healed the physical corruption. Blue's tears healed their minds so that they stopped being wired to animalistic instincts. Stephen's tears calmed them down enough to stop the thoughts that started the corruption initially. And White's tears made the others permanent. But without Stephen, would he revert? White's would counteract the corruption no matter what by making sure that Blue and Yellow's effects stayed stuck. But he would stay just as panicked as he was whenever he reached this point of corruption. The same emotional strain, the same guilt and hopelessness, the same broken state of mind. What would happen to him? She guessed they were about to find out. Nephrite watched as the mixture swirled around his scaly body, seeping past the plated pink armor, washing through his gem. There was a moment of gravitating pause, leaving her to think that maybe this wouldn't work, before Stephen suddenly seized up with a frenzied, agonized wail. And then he began to shrink. It wasn't smooth, or fast. She clung to his nose as he howled in pain, his whole body gripped in violent spasms. Mint Diamond hurriedly began to move him as he became smaller and smaller, managing to roll him onto dry land with the diamond's essence still soaking his gem. Eventually, his head became tiny enough to where she couldn't stand on it anymore. Her feet touched the wet, muddy sand, her hands still holding both sides of his face firmly. "It's almost over, Stephen. You're okay. You're doing good," Nephrite told him as the scales retreated, the spine sinking down into his back, his tail slithering further into his spine. He didn't reform to look exactly like Stephen, mostly because it wasn't just Stephen. Nephrite had been briefly filled in by his family. He had fused with his dead human partner in an attempt to save her life, but she wasn't alive to coordinate, resulting in a mutated, one-sided fusion. The fusion was mostly Stephen, with a set of thinner arms for Connie as well as patches of darker skin, a boost of height added to him due to the extra human mass so that he was about 7 feet tall. Connie didn't seem to be conscious or in control of their actions at all. She might be permanently dead, with her corpse melted uselessly into his body in some illusion of hope. Either way, this caused him to be horribly deformed, to the point where his face still had 4 eyes that were melted together like wax. His body was mangled and twitching, his torn clothes stretched over his body, and his shredded pink jacket hanging loosely off his shoulders. The scars from the corruption still lingered. He had curled pink horns poking through his dark, tangled, salty hair, patches of hardened magenta scales over the backs of his hands, his cheeks, his shoulders, his knees, and, most of all, in a spreading splotch around the dotted gem in his pulsing stomach. His fusing pupils were as pink and diamond-shaped as ever, his teeth sharp, tusks jutting out of his jaw. He was a pincushion of spines, the tips of his fingers hooked with claws, impossible to approach at almost any angle. Nephrite knew that all uncorrupted gems had scars like that, horns, fangs, claws, scales, but this was quite a lot, or at least more scars than she'd seen on any of her friends. Her scars were just jagged teeth and prickling hooks at the tips of each of her fingers, like a centipede. Stephen's made up about 1/3 of his body. She knew the scars would gradually recede over time in healing, but this was such an unusual amount of it. What had happened to her poor friend in the time that they'd lived their own lives? She tried to put her questions aside, instead holding his head up to try and gain his attention, whispering to him, good job, Stephen. It's over, see? You're back. You're safe." He looked so stunned, utterly speechless, staring at her like she wasn't real. His body buckled the rest of the way, and he fell into the sand, his fall lessened by Nephrite's hold. His mouth was moving without words escaping, his whole body racked with trembling, despite the fact that he felt warm to the touch. Finally, he managed to say something. And it wasn't anything more than an echoing, tearful ramble, frantic and senseless. "I'm not Pink Diamond, I'm worse. I'm not Pink Diamond, I'm worse. I'm not Pink Diamond, I'm worse." He looked broken. She worried for the lack of Stephen's part of the Diamond's healing tears. He was still in the same mental state that he had been whenever he began to corrupt. Even though he wasn't monstrous anymore, this ordeal was far from over.